Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com.
The Educational Ministry of Bethany Lutheran Church of Kerman, California supports this podcast through co-host Pastor Greg Camp. Church services are available on Zoom at www.bethanykerman.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Scriptural Works. I'm one of your co-hosts, Patrick Spencer. Greg Camp, my other co-host, is joining me. Greg, good to see you as always.
Good morning, Patrick. Yes, it's a nice foggy morning here in Central California, but I think our guest today is going to shed a little light on the fog that we have around a particular question that has stumped people.
Very, very true. We actually are foggy here in Seattle as well. Who knows, out in Utah they may be as well. It's a foggy West Coast. So Lincoln Blumell is joining us today. He is, Lincoln, thanks for joining us. Before we jump into your bio, we're really excited to talk to you about your he has a new brand new book, which some of you may be aware of, which has a really, really interesting proposal. He looks at ancient papyri, letters. He looks at ancient textual criticism and ancient manuscripts. It's a fascinating book, and we're going to be talking about it today. So, Lincoln, thanks for joining us.
Great to be on. We're looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, and I'll do a quick intro for Lincoln for those who are not familiar with his work. And he's written a bunch of different books and articles. If you're familiar with his bio, he's going to be talking about his textual discovery, as I mentioned, that sort of overturns how we understand specifically the first verse of 2 John and the addressee. And this is part of our series on the Johannine epistles, just to give that introduction. We've had a couple episodes thus far, and this one is going to be really, really exciting, particularly since this book is hot off the press. He's the Associate Dean of Research and a full professor in the Department of Ancient Scripture at Brigham Young University. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Calgary, the University of Oxford, and Christchurch, and a PhD from the University of Toronto. He's the author and editor of over 90 articles and 5 books, as I just mentioned, including Christian Oxyrhynchus Text, Documents, and Sources, published by Baylor back in 2015. He has a new monograph called, as I just mentioned, which is what the subject of today's podcast is going to be on, Lady Eclecte, the Lost Woman of the New Testament, published by Fortress Press. It came back out, I think it was in October or November, so it's only been out for a couple months. It's a fascinating study, as we're going to get into here in a moment. Before we do so, let's do a quick ad from our sponsor, one of our sponsors. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you grow in faith and impact. Learn more at acu.edu/GST. That's acu.edu/GST. Well, Lincoln, we're excited about this conversation. I'll let Greg kick it off.
Yeah, Lincoln, you're an Egyptian papyrologist. You work with papyri, and you've come across a potential solution, or as many people are calling it now, that it is a solution to a problem that New Testament scholars since at least 1881, when Westcott just declared that this problem was insoluble. What drew you to this particular question, and how did you find this solution?
That's a great question. What took me to this question, really 2 and 3 John, is most of my work. I do a lot in early Christianity, but I do most of my publishing in Greek papyrology. And so I work, in fact, my dissertation was on Greek letters, in fact, Christian letters from Oxyrhynchus. And so getting into, these letters from Egypt, editing lots of letters, reading lots of letters, 2 and 3 John always struck me as they shared a lot of affinities with these letters that are preserved on papyrus from Egypt. And what's interesting, of course, in 2 John, it's the only letter in the New Testament on which we know the medium on which it was written. In fact, it mentions, there's that gloss written, I won't write with you with, what paper and ink, that's a modern rendering, but it's actually a papyrus. And so it's pretty clear here that the writer is writing on papyrus. That kind of, jumped out to me. And, looking at these letters, they're kind of short. Papyrus letters are pretty short to the point. They follow a certain format. And so I found these in that regard to be very much like, the literally hundreds or thousands of letters I've looked at, read. But the difference was when you read the opening of 2 John, it's just really quite strange. Ancient letters, especially in the Roman period, have a very standard form of an opening, right? They call it an epistolary prescript, where they always begin with the first words are always, right, refer to the sender, given their name or a title, immediately followed by the name of the addressee. And then if there's any modifier they might have after that, it follows in that order, then there'll be a greeting. And this is really standard. In fact, I'll edit, an ancient papyrus that's just loaded with holes. Bugs have eaten through it over the centuries. Yeah. And yet when I get to these formulaic sections, if I get a couple letters, I can reconstruct multiple lines because I can anticipate, this has got to be here, this has got to be here. There's these very standard formulae. And when you read 3 John 1, this is what you get. You get, right, the elder, very first thing, ho presbyteros. The third word is Gaius. And then it's, right, to agapeto, right, which would be the beloved. It would be literally, right, the elder to Gaius the beloved. And this is really standard. But when you go over to 2 John, you now have the elder. And the way it's articulated in every Greek New Testament is that you have an adjective, or elect. And then you have kuria. And this is just really unusual. In fact, you mentioned Westcott earlier on, Westcott and Hort, 2 really exceptional scholars of Greek in the New Testament at the end of the 19th century. And, looking at their, research, in fact, what the insights they bring to the text, I think, are still relevant 150 years later, really remarkable. And even they recognize that, in fact, the Greek doesn't really work well. Now, what they didn't have at that time was the study of Greek papyri from Egypt. It wasn't until the next decade where, archaeologists start going there and start unearthing this stuff. And it's really like the turn of the 19th, 20th century. You get this, that you don't realize there's all these patterns. But they recognize some problems with it. And so it's kind of taking a certain set of eyes that I have with ancient Greek letters, coming across a passage in Clement of Alexandria that I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later on that says, this letter is written to a woman called Eclecte, and kind of putting this all together and being, wait a second, the way it's articulated in our Greek New Testament isn't right. In fact, somewhere along the way, 2 reduplicated Greek letters got dropped out. And when you restore those, and this is a really common error when I read ancient texts, the reading now just mirrors exactly what you have in 3 John 1 in terms of collocations. You have the elder, instead of now an adjective, it's now a woman's name, Eclecte is a name. We'll get to that. And then you have te kuria, which is a very common form of address for women, to call them lady. You have the same with man, kurios. And so it then makes sense. And so it kind of all fit together. And then the work of looking at the name, manuscripts, and everything kind of came from that. But really, it was my work with Greek papyri that first kind of anticipate what should be there that was really helpful in making this discovery.
Wow. This is fascinating stuff. Maybe for our readers, so they have a little context, particularly in regards to all the work you do, because you're headed off to Egypt here, I think shortly, another week or so, to go through papyri digs, and who knows what you're going to find. That'll be your next book, probably. Our audience, I think Greg and I in 1 or 2 episodes have talked a bit or alluded to oxyrhynchus. Maybe speak to what that is and how that has actually impacted New Testament studies or early Christian studies.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That's a great question. In Egypt, just for your listeners, it's unique for a number of reasons. When you think about the ancient world is because, most of people in Egypt live in the Nile Valley, right? This very small vein that kind of runs through right from the south all the way down, up to the north. And then, you have the Nile Delta where all like the heads of the Nile split off. But it's otherwise, outside the valley, it's very dry, it's very arid. And what's remarkable about Egypt is that because of those circumstances, it does an exceptional job of preserving ancient artifacts. So, right, inscriptions, things like that can be, thousands of years old. They might discover, right, they're covered by sand and things like that. They're exceptionally well preserved, where if you have an inscription, for example, I don't know, somewhere in Turkey or, right, certainly people write papyrus is like the ancient paper. This stuff very rarely survives except by special circumstances pretty much elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. But in Egypt, it has survived in abundance because of these dry conditions. And so we get access to sources that you just don't get anywhere else. And I don't think Egypt is unique in this regard. I think it's just unique because they've survived. I think everyone was using, right, papyrus. There's lots of these writing, these texts. They just haven't survived. Now, in Egypt, there's this city. In Egyptian, it's called Pemja. In Greek, they call it oxyrhynchus. And oxyrhynchus is actually a name of a fish, like a sturgeon fish in the Nile with a sharp nose. And so oxy in Greek means sharp. And so it's this sharp-nosed fish. There's a lot of cities in Egypt that are basically dedicated to an animal that's kind of personified as a deity, and this is oxyrhynchus. And what's remarkable about this city, it was a notable city in Egypt in its time. It's kind of a Roman period. It goes back to Pharaonic, but really it seems to really kind of expands during the Roman period. But what's remarkable is that there were two Oxford scholars who go to Egypt in the late 1890s, about 1896, 1897, and they're looking for manuscripts. And there is this story about oxyrhynchus by a Christian monk in the late 4th century saying it's just full of churches, it's full of monasteries, it has like 15,000, monks and like 20,000 nuns and all this. And they go there looking for papyri, thinking, well, maybe we can find some Christian manuscripts. They spend some time in the cemetery, don't find any, but in fact, you have these large garbage mounds outside the ancient city, and they began, excavating there, and they just stumbled upon literally tens of thousands of papyri and fragments of papyri. And the reason why it's important for early Christianity is because a number of early Christian texts have been discovered there. So our earliest fragments of the New Testament, probably 3/4 or 80% come from oxyrhynchus. And so this is why it's important generally, but just specifically for the text of the New Testament, because we're kind of looking at the city, we're finding these scraps of the New Testament there. And, they date as early as the 2nd century, but then you get 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century in this whole period.
And are there more oxyrhynchuses out there, Lincoln? Is that one of the reasons you keep going to Egypt?
Well, I sure hope so. I think there, it's, you always kind of hope, when you get out there that there's more to be found. I think, in Egypt, now with a lot of, like they have LiDAR, surveys and things like this, they're doing a lot of work to see, what's out there. I'm not sure if you'll find maybe a find of that magnitude. It's not inconceivable, but I think there's still lots of smaller finds that are still nonetheless very important, that are still waiting to be unearthed in Egypt. And the other thing too is I found in Egypt, but even here, in the U.S. and around the world, there's stuff that goes to museum that just sits there for decades, and no one's read it, no one's properly published it. So I think there's still a lot of things that will be found just in museums that kind of are sitting there on shelves that will be important pieces of evidence for Christianity or other material in the ancient world.
Right.
That's fascinating.
Everybody likes the excitement of the big find. It's our Indiana Jones kind of affection here. But as you say, there's a lot of nitty gritty work to be done once we find this, and somebody has to analyze it. So one of the things that you mentioned is that with this particular text, that there was a duplication of letters that people dropped out at some point. Now, this is the nitty gritty that somebody who studies these has to get into at some point. It's not the big sexy news. What's this process of dropping letters? What's it called, and how do you recognize it? And in this case, why is it important?
Yeah, so in this case, there's various errors. So when I read an ancient text, I work on some papyri right now. They're quite different. So number one, there's no word spacing in ancient Greek. Everything is just put right together. There's none, if hardly any, punctuation in ancient Greek. And I'm here talking mostly about the Roman period, Byzantine period. They don't have any capital letters. And so we'll capitalize proper nouns. And so all these are kind of reading aids, right? You divide up letters, things like that. By the way, Hebrew, Dead Sea Scrolls actually does have word divisions. Greek doesn't do this. And so when you see an ancient text, it's really kind of disorienting. If you imagine an English, document all written with just continuous text, no script, imagine all caps, just a full page. And you're thinking, okay, where do I break words? Where do I start words? It's a challenge to get through this. And so I find ancient text, I'm always trying, okay, where does the word end? Where does it begin? And one of the things, of course we have, and it's kind of, I can speak for myself, certainly, that even we have all these tools like spell checking and AI, it's amazing how many errors I introduce into a first draft of, a paper or an article or something like that. And you're like, wow. And I'll have TAs help me out. It's like, how did I miss this? Well, imagine you go back to the ancient world, you have none of that. And so people are just writing. And so you get all kinds of, unusual like spellings, like phonetic spellings, with vowels and stuff. And so when I started editing ancient text, one of the things that there'll be, maybe a simple text on a papyrus or an inscription, but more often than not, you have to create a whole apparatus saying, I know what they're trying to say, but the way they did grammar, they dropped out an article, they terminated a word wrong, it can't be this, they spelled it wrong here. So you have a whole apparatus at the bottom saying, here's how it should be, spelled and read. You leave it as is, and you do that because it tells us maybe how people are sounding out words, things like that. And so it's that kind of thing that kind of got me then into saying, wait a second here. We have in our all print editions, Eclecte Curia, which is, right, elect lady. But in Greek, what you would need properly in introduction is Eclecte with this tau eta, think of a th, and then a te, a definite article, then Curia. And so this is what I'm saying, right? We have a shorter reading in our Greek manuscripts where people say, well, elect lady, but it should be Eclecte, then that te is really key. And then Curia, because that means now what is before it has to be a proper name, and what follows now is a modifier, right? It'd be a substantive. I'm throwing out some jargon here, but this is just standard. This is what you get in 3 John 1. This is the exact form. You have Gaius, it's the in Greek here, that, the beloved. And so it's, Eclecte, the lady. And it dawned on me that, wait a second, this is dropped out. And where it kind of came together is I was looking at some ancient papyrus letters, and there was one that I came across where this very error had happened, where you address it to somebody, and there it was called the dearest, but the definite article between the name and the adjective modifying name had dropped out. And this is common just because it ends with the same letter the name does. And so I began looking at this. In fact, this is a fairly common phenomenon, to drop an article here or there. And I said, well, this makes the most sense because now the Greek grammar makes sense. It will now match the collocation of 3 John 1. And then, lo and behold, this reading even appears in some manuscripts, and no one had noticed that. So I can understand why people get a bit nervous, saying, "Well, why are you messing around with the text? Be careful when you go and do this." I understand that. What I would say is, as a papyrologist, if I had, let's say I found 2 John, or somebody found 2 John today, right? We didn't know about it, and it even had this shorter reading. Not a single papyrologist in the world would translate it as elect lady. They would just put in, right? They would say, no, there's clearly a haplography here. It's just Eclecte, and then you put these brackets, we call them caret brackets, because it means you have to insert Greek text to make it sense. That's how they would resolve it. And not a single person would, argue about that. In fact, I'd say, again, if I were to find this, it would be no more than a footnote in a papyrological edition of a papyrus. When it comes to the New Testament, what a footnote is now becomes a 300-page book. To make the case, that actually there are 2 letters missing. Because it's just so common. But it was very enjoyable to do that, by the way. But this is just to give you kind of what's going on here. It's a very, very simple mistake, very common, but in this case, it has huge implications because we're now not dealing with some, metaphor for a church, and, as an elect lady. We're now dealing with an actual named woman.
And for those who are watching the show, what we're putting up on the screen is a box that will have an example of what this actually looks like, so you can see what's being dropped out and what the received text is versus what your reconstruction is. So those of you who are only listening may want to pop in and take a look at that chart.
Yeah.
So haplography is where a word perhaps ends with some letters and the next one begins with it, and they drop out that duplication.
Yeah, this is what you have. And so in this case, you end with this th, and then the is a th, right, a tau eta. And so it ends up getting dropped. And so somebody writes that, but it gets a shorter reading. It's interesting because there's been, in textual criticism of the New Testament, there's, the standard in the field was always, they say in Latin, like lectio brevior, the shorter reading is the better one. But in fact, there was work done by James Royce on New Testament manuscripts a few years ago. And he looked at all our early major papyrus manuscripts of the New Testament and said, in fact, the opposite is true. In most cases, the longer reading, and when he means longer, he means, when we're dropping a few letters or a word or something, is actually seems to be the more original, and scribes would inadvertently drop. They're not actually deliberately adding, they're inadvertently dropping. And this, again, in papyri and epigraphy, I see this all the time, like, this is the kind of thing you would expect.
Yeah. Anybody who's copied something manually does this. It's pretty routine.
Yes, it goes from te to te, because one of the te's get eliminated. If you're watching online, you can see that in what we have thrown up on the screen here. It's really quite interesting. One aspect about you've sort of alluded to this a bit, Lincoln, that I found interesting as I read through it was the autobiographical nature of it. Not all scholars, most scholars, very few for that matter, will write a book in this nature where you'll actually walk us through how you came up with this idea. It wasn't, here's the idea, but you take a number of pages to walk us through your investigation and the research that you underwent to reach this conclusion, which I found quite fascinating. And you spoke about Clement of Alexandria. Number one, our audience may not be familiar with Clement of Alexandria, so it'd probably be useful for you to give us a quick intro in terms of who he was. But then, why did you start with him, and how did he get you thinking along the lines of the conclusion that you eventually reached?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, you have the papyrology side informing us. And, I was in Egypt when this kind of all was coming together. And I was working on some inscriptions, and you have these online search engines in Greek, and so when you're dealing with inscription, it's broken off, and you're like, well, what word tends to follow this word? And you're doing all these searching, and I came across Clement's writings. I've read some Clement, I've done some work on him, but not a whole lot, and so that kind of got me interested in Clement. And I began looking at Clement, that he has, he writes, we know from Eusebius, our early, writes the first church history that we have that's extant. He talks about Clement and said that Clement wrote this massive commentary, in English called Sketches, but it doesn't exist anymore, right? It's fell into disuse, and we don't have it anymore. But he talks about this a number of times, and he said he gives commentary, brief commentary on most of the books of the Bible as well as other texts, which is really interesting. And it turns out that in a later Latin translation from the 6th century, we actually have Clement's kind of brief commentary on a few letters in the New Testament. And when I came across his commentary on 2 John, it's really short. It's about, paragraph and a half. It's pretty straightforward. But what's interesting is he begins it by saying, it's written to a woman by name Eclecte. And that's where everything was like, wait a second here. He says some things about this letter that, he's reading into the letter. Often writers, eisegesis, you're reading something, exegesis, what are you reading out? He's reading in, she's from Babylon and this. I think there's an influence there from 2 Peter. She was, writing to virgins. Again, that's not mentioned in 2 John. That's kind of a tradition that develops, we see. But the one exegetical claim he's making is the woman's name's Eclecte. And I knew enough to say, well, clearly Clement's reading the third word, right, of this letter as a proper name. And that's where it kind of all came together and saying, this is what the reading is. And, again, with ancient Christian, commentators, I always say to myself, their Greek is way better than mine will ever be. They're native speakers. And so I really should pay attention as opposed to just dismissing this and saying, he doesn't know what he's talking about. What's he saying? And then you're like, no, he's reading this as a proper name because it is, and here's how it should be reconstructed. And with Clement, he's writing at the end of the 2nd, early 3rd century. In the book, I go through that. In fact, we don't have really another person talking about the opening of 2 John really till like the 5th century. And not surprisingly, there's not a whole lot of discussion of the first verse. It's kind of really hit and miss. Then by the time you get the 6th, 7th century, you get some more discussion. So he's the only writer in close proximity. And something else is that epistolary, changes take place in the Roman Empire. So in the Byzantine Empire, they have a different beginning to letters. But Clement's still in the Roman period. He's seeing this. And it's like he's seeing this, and so he was helpful in kind of bringing this all together, saying in the 2nd century, late 2nd century, this is how it was being understood. And then, putting it all together, the Greek and then the manuscripts, really important piece of this puzzle in kind of bringing it out.
So, Lincoln, in your work, you found examples of this name as an actual name. Talk about some of the attestations, the places that you found these. What's the evidence that it's a person's name and not a ghost name or a different way of referring to a group of people?
Yeah, that's a great question because, when I brought this up, because my scholars are like, what, this is just an adjective. It can't be a name. But in Greek, you have to kind of break it down. There's really 2 kinds of names in proper Greek names. There's a simple names. And a simple name is just a name that's undifferent. It's the same as a noun or an adjective. Think of the name Stephen, right? Stephanos. You have the name Stephen. You also have Stephanos means crown or wreath. And that would be a simple name. You have compound names. It's like 2 nouns, 2 adjectives, Nicodemus, or names like this that, you put them together. And so in Greek, one of the things that's challenging when I read ancient texts is when you come across a word, right, let's take Stephanos, you think to yourself, well, is this a crown or is this an actual person? And that's where context says, okay, context says this should be read as a proper name, or no, this is just as a crown. And so when you think of this word, eclectic, it is the feminine adjective for elect. There's also, of course, the masculine eclecta, but it also is a woman's name. It's undifferentiated. So what you do in these cases is context says, well, is it better here to take it as an adjective or as a name? And so as I began looking at this, right, Clement mentioned this, and occasionally, right, over the years, no one proposed this reading, right, to kind of solve this, but people said, well, if this were to be a name, it doesn't exist anywhere. So it's kind of like, it was kind of, there was a thought on this. Occasionally scholars might devote, a couple sentences. Well, this Greek name, right, as woman's name, doesn't appear in any, Greek literary sources. And so meaning like ancient Greek literature, it doesn't appear. It appears once in Latin literature, right? Clement mentions the name. But, doing a lot of work with names, especially with inscriptions of papyri, most of our names, the ancient world, you find in, right, these kind of, routine documents. You have name lists from cities or towns or tax lists or census documents where, literally, in a papyrus of multiple columns, you'll have 400 or 500 names. And, then you'll find 15 brand new names that have never been attested before. So this is the kind of evidence you want to go to say, does this name really exist? And so when you go to Greek inscriptions, which is our best evidence for names across the Mediterranean, you have 18 attestations of this name, and it appears both in Latin as well as in Greek. And so it appears in 16 Latin inscriptions, mostly from Italy, but also you get them kind of further west into Spain. And the inscriptions typically date from the Roman period, so first, second, in the beginning of the 3rd century. And then you have 2 Greek inscriptions, both from Italy, that also contain this name. And just something with the name, when it appears in Latin, it's Eclecte, but when you come across that in Latin, you're still saying that's attesting a Greek name because that is the Greek adjective, right? The Latin adjective is Eclecta, and that's also a woman's name. So what you're seeing here is you're having this strong evidence, 18 names, and Clement mentions 19 names. Very clear this was a woman's name. Now, this might not sound like a lot. People say, well, gee, that's really rare. But when you start putting into perspective, I do this in the chapter, in the book, chapter 5. In fact, it appears more commonly in this kind of evidence than, nearly a quarter of the women's names that already appear in the New Testament, like Lois, for example. Lois doesn't appear anywhere else, which is really strange. Again, that just might be the nature of the evidence. Tomorrow we find some text and it appears. So it fits well within the range. And so it is definitely a woman's name and is not a ghost name.
Wow. You spoke about this a bit already, but just so we understand the context, 3rd John has the formulaic introduction, if you may, a salutation, where it's the elder to Gaius, the beloved. The same formula you believe exists here. We just are missing that article in the text that you think was omitted accidentally during the scribal process. Can you talk a bit about this formulaic structure and you see it in 3rd John, explain it to our audience and explain exactly how you think it existed in 2nd John and that's how it explains the omission of the article.
Yeah, you bet. So, in 3 John, right, you have the Greek is ho, just like the presbyteros, so the elder. And then, in Roman, you always need a name next. And, some interesting perceptive scholars, right, that have noticed saying it's really strange. They say there's not a definite article after the elder, right? Because if it were an adjective, you would want a definite article to front that. And there was various theories put out. And the simple answer is there's no definite article because the 3rd word in 2 John is a name. It doesn't need a definite article. In epistolary address, they don't do this. They just have the name. So in 3 John, right, you have the elder, and you have to Gaius, right? That's the 3rd word. And so it's saying to Gaius, and then you have this, definite article, to, that's the masculine form, the beloved. And that's pretty standard, right? Sender, addressee, modifier. Yeah. And this, it's when you look at the Roman period, this kind of address, you have literally over, probably about 1,800 examples of this. This is the same kind of pattern, right? Different names, titles, this out. It's just very common. Now, when you go to 2 John, you have, the elder, the same thing. But then instead of a proper name, they have it as an adjective. And again, adjectives in epistolary address never front, they never begin, a letter. It wouldn't front a name or anything else in the Roman period. Byzantine period, actually, you do get this change. So you look at this and say, well, this has got to be a proper name. There's no definite article before it. So it's the elder to Eclecte. And because you have that te ending, when you have another te, right, Eclecte te, curia would be the lady. You have curia, you have kurios. It means lord or master, but it's actually quite common in letters. There's a number of examples I include in the book. And it's this very same pattern. It's always the name, definite article, then the title. And even when the definite article doesn't appear in papyri letters, you restore that because you're saying this is clearly the meaning here. So, when you put together, it just works perfectly. So now you have the same collocation. When I work with ancient letters on papyrus, but you find that writers, even though they might write letters for very, very different purposes, they always keep the same collocation at the start of a letter. And so I give various examples of this. And, in the case of, 2 and 3 John, there's no reason to think any differently. That in fact, what you have is the same collocation. 2 letters got dropped out. It was interesting because there's a vein in New Testament scholarship where they're always wanting, they want to, you find this, no, or it seems writes the same to, text. And so there's always, pseudonymous authorship. And really, I think it's, quite frankly, is taken to an extreme in the New Testament. But speaking just about 2 and 3 John, because you have this strange beginning, right, elect lady, there is a strong vein in scholarship that says, well, whoever wrote 3 John did not write 2 John because it's totally different. And you have this strange opening to the letter. And, my response is no, just 2 reduplicated letters got dropped out. And that makes perfect sense because when you read 2 and 3 John, having read, just thousands of letters, you're really hard pressed to say these were written by two different people. It's the elder writing to two named people. And so this solves that, because otherwise the letters have the same form, same form. They use some of the same verbs. Of course, they're different letters because they're different circumstances. But it's really quite significant saying, no, this is clearly the elder wrote both 2 John and 3 John.
So, Lincoln, the current reading for many people, and it probably has been for a couple hundred years, is that the elect lady is a metaphor for a church congregation rather than a specific person. And you've been talking about why that's not accurate in a technical sense. But what else does the church get wrong by making this a metaphor for a congregation rather than a specific person?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you see this, in the book, I go back to kind of 1881, right? The last 150 years, this has been really kind of the received interpretation. And it does go back in the medieval period. You'll have manuscripts where they'll actually put a note, right? For lady, they'll put, you'll have under curia, they'll put a note saying, read in the margin, it'll say, read this as ecclesia or as church. And so it does go back, a ways. I think, when I came across this and really started digging into this, and you read, 2 John, it presupposes this large metaphor that covers a letter. And, there truly are, metaphors in the New Testament, the Bible. But, 2 John never struck me as a letter where the writer says, well, I'm going to have kind of an overarching metaphor. Really straightforward. Look at 3 John, mentions people, right? Gaius, Demetrius, Diotrephes, others. And so it doesn't really make sense to have this broad metaphor and to assume it's a church. And so this is the way they explain it. Now, when you have a named woman in there, what you get with Eclecte is, in some ways, it doesn't drastically change everything in the letter. In fact, I think, some of the insights letters say, in fact, we can now refine them a little bit. It does, as I read this, I don't say, well, there's now a major, theological change. No, I don't see that. I think we refine it and we say, isn't this amazing? We're actually seeing now a woman. And I think the best way to read the letter now is it gets down to verse 10. It talks about a house. And even scholars, they would read for at church, they say, well, it's got to be like a house church. But for me, it makes more sense saying, no, he's writing to Eclecte, and there's a house where she, I think, is likely the proprietor, not for certain, but basically acts in some ways as a gatekeeper to that home and can basically admit people. And so the elder says, look, if people coming along carrying a certain doctrine, do not let them into the home. And she's kind of given the principal charge with this. And this would make some sense, I would say, anciently, because we often think about women, and even the title curia is often the title for it, right, kind of somebody who is, right, the, quote, mistress of the home. This is kind of their domain. And so I think you see now, wow, we're seeing an early Christian, right? Not some general congregation like this is written to any, church. It's kind of a Catholic letter, but it's written to a specific locale where Eclecte wields some degree of authority and can be trusted by the elder. And in fact, has the ability to, not extend hospitality, right? Don't give greetings to this person who might come in, who is teaching something the elder doesn't agree with. And so she has a position of authority. Also with the, address, this comes up. I don't bring this, well, I get to this in the book, but, the full address is to the lady Eclecte and her children.
Yeah. Right.
So right there, I would take children there, in a metaphorical meaning, which is also in 3 John. It's a very literal letter, but talks about brothers and sisters and children in the same way, where I think the most natural reading would be to take it in that way. So what we're seeing now in this letter is a woman who holds some degree of authority, who's given instruction. She can be trusted by the elder, and is not to extend hospitality, and thereby kind of let somebody into this community, this gathering, who is carrying teachings that are at variance with what the elder has been outlining. And so it's really quite remarkable. You're seeing really the contours of a house church is what I see there without it explicitly saying that.
Right. And she has a sister who is doing the same thing?
Well, this is interesting. So you get to the end of the letter, and then it says, the children of your elect sister send greetings. Now, traditionally, it was thought to be, well, this must be another church. Here, I take sister as, again, right, an actual woman. And what I see here now is a pun on the word elect, right? Some people had argued historically that however you read, right, this word eclecte is how you have to read it in verse 13. And so they say, well, it's an adjective in verse 13. Well, it's likely an adjective then in verse 1. But no, I actually see what you're saying here is you have a proper name in verse 1 and now the adjective form. So it's a pun on the sister saying, I'm writing to your, elect sister. It's clearly referring to the sister there, saying, right, she is elect. But I think also this pun is not missed on Eclecte, the elder doing this. And when you have this, this is not evidence of like a high literature. In fact, we can all think of the example in, Matthew 16, right? You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build, right? And so you have, and this is really common in with Greek simple names, where they're undifferentiated from a noun or an adjective. You'll find these kind of, puns will go on. There's examples I bring papyri. You also have one in Philemon, right, with one semis that will come about being, useful, or basically not useful,
right.
that comes up there. So this is how I see this. So I would say there's another person that is known to Eclecte, right? A sister in the faith, and there are people there sending greetings to Eclecte via the elder.
Okay.
When someone does that at the end of the letter, it lends credence to the author as well. Lincoln, is that part of what's going on here? You have that in other New Testament letters, or just epistolary letters in general?
Yeah, you have this a lot. You have New Testament in some letters where, the big one, of course, is Romans 16. So and so, greet this, greet, you have this. It's very common, this verb. You find it, in 3 John also has it. The friends are sending greetings. It's a way to be cordial. And often in the ancient world, what seems to be the case in papyri letters, because it's really quite common, the same verb is used, same form, is it seems that you finish writing a letter and people say, oh, you're writing so-and-so, oh, send that person my greetings. And so everybody in the house says, oh, my son sends greetings and so-and-so sends greetings and all this, just because communication is not as frequent. And so this is kind of a personal touch. I think it shows kind of closeness of the elder, right, Eclecte, and those communities. There certainly is, some strong bonds. And we also find this, Romans 16, but even in some other letters, you find in the New Testament the same things of greetings being
right. Is there a point here where we read this and suddenly we realize there's a letter written to a woman, only letter in the New Testament that's written to a woman? Does it say something about the role of women in early Christianity at all? Is there something that we can take away from your discovery here?
Yeah, I think it does, speak to that. This is significant because, my argument is Eclecte has always been there. We've just articulated it wrong. But yeah, this is really significant to have. There's one letter addressed to a named woman. She's the principal addressee. Now, what I outlined a little bit, right? She has some authority. It's pretty clear. I'm always reluctant to put too much in there. I say, what can we say? Like some people, right? This title curia in late antiquity. So you get to like the 4th, 5th century. Some people say, well, this could even, kind of double for, deacon. I'm not comfortable going that far. Maybe she was, but we can't say just on that title alone. But clearly wielded some authority. In fact, the fact that the elder regards her as having some children, who I don't think it would necessarily be actually biological children, just like the elder talks about his own children, that she has some authority there, I think speaks to her status. But also, I don't think this is unusual when we look around, right, to the larger New Testament. We look at people like in Colossians, 4:15, like Nympha. We have, right, a church meeting in her home. We have, right, Priscilla, right, Aquila and Priscilla, who clearly, right, are missionaries who have some degree of, authority and will go and will teach. We have, Phoebe in Romans 16. So I would now add Eclecte into this mix, that somebody who is playing an important role, and we can kind of say something about kind of the contours based on the letter of that role, but trusted, respected, and can expect to faithfully carry out, right, some charges the elder gives her in this letter.
Lincoln, this term you mentioned, curie, which is the feminine version of kurios, that's not used for any of the other women in the New Testament. So is this a generic term for lady, or does it carry a little bit more weight? Maybe not like deacon and some title in that sense, but the fact that there's a masculine counterpart to it in kurios that we do put a lot of weight on. What do you make of that?
Yeah, this title, curia, only appears twice in the New Testament, in 2 John 1 and in 2 John 5. Yeah, of course, kurios appears, in a variety of settings, right? Lord. Outside of the New Testament, again, I go to letters. It's a really common beginning to a letter when writing to a woman. They'll say, to so-and-so the lady, or you'll have to a man, to so-and-so, the Lord. And it's a title of respect. People thought this, meant, maybe initially when they read this title, thought, well, it means that somebody's in servitude writing to somebody who is in a higher station. Not the case. These are kind of the equivalents of the Latin, dominus lord or domina lady. And you find these a lot, the people that kind of, in fact, Seneca says for ladies, is kind of a standard greeting for women, right? Domina. And so I think this is just a standard, a greeting. It's certainly a sign of respect. What's interesting is you'll find in letters also, for both men and women, they'll say, I'm greeting my lady sister or my lord brother. And so it's kind of a hierarchical title, but you're like a brother. So it's just a sign of respect. So it's not used in the New Testament outside of this. But here in this letter, it's not unusual when you compare it to other letters outside, where you do have often, as a sign of respect, it's addressed, used for women quite commonly in the Roman period, based on the papyrus letters that we have.
Yeah.
Now, Lincoln, you talk a bit about the manuscript evidence. I think it's chapter, I'm trying to remember the chapters. I think it's chapter 4. Hopefully I didn't get the chapter wrong. And you have three types of, Greg and I have discussed this in some previous podcasts with other guests, but you have three types of manuscripts that exist. You have papyri, then you have these that are unsealed, sort of written in the capital letters. Then you have minuscules that are cursive. They're a little later than the unseals. Talk about the evidence that exists in regards to 2 John in each of these three buckets and where that led you in terms of your discovery.
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I first made this and put it all together, I said, well, this is great, but is it just a conjectural reading? Meaning, it's a great conjecture. It makes a lot of sense, but there's no manuscript support for this. And so when you look at, the evidence in the New Testament, right, our earliest evidence are in papyri. Eventually we talk about Octyrhynchus. And then you get some big unseals, like I would call them pandect Bibles, like at the beginning of the 4th century, like kind of a very famous Codex Vaticanus, the Vatican Library, Sinaiticus, and the British Library. And then as you get into kind of like the later Byzantine period, you get minuscules written in it would be like a cursive Greek, right? Instead of like kind of block letters. And so this is and those minuscules go right up to like the 15th century. And so this is kind of the evidence you have for the New Testament. And so typically you're like, well, if something's earlier, as a general principle, it should be, you think better evidence than, a minuscule manuscript written in the 14th century. Now, for 2 John, and here just going to the first verse, what was interesting is, I began looking at manuscripts. And for whatever reason, our manuscript evidence for the first verse of 2 John is extremely fragmentary. Really until you get about the 8th or 9th century, which is really interesting. So you have these two big Bibles, right? Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, which are really remarkable specimens from probably the second half of the 4th century. They both have 2 John, and in both cases it preserves the shorter reading, so that te is not there, just Eclecte Curia. Then you get Codex Alexandrinus, which is like the 5th century. It's an important text. But what's interesting is that 2 John begins in the outside column of the right-hand page. And for whatever reason, the top corner of the page is torn off. So that reading is actually torn off right there. And so you can't actually say, and you could easily fit the 2 extra letters in there or not. And so we don't actually know what the reading is on that. And then it doesn't appear in other, the majuscules. You don't happen to have that for some time. And you have some papyri of 2 John, and like a parchment fragment. But what's, again, frustrating is that in one of the parchment fragments, it begins at the beginning, of 2 John with Curia. That's the top of the page. And so that's like, what we want is what's before it. But for whatever reason, that was written on a previous page of a manuscript, and so it's lost. And so we're like, well, we don't know. It's Curia. And so no, we don't know there. You have another parchment manuscript of 2 John in the Vatican, and it's actually a palimpsested text. So it had the biblical text, and it got washed off. And it was later used for like the writings of Gregory of Nyssa. And so you can see the very top of the page, right? 2 John, but then the first verse is so washed off, you can't really make anything out until about halfway through. So that's from the 5th century. And then you have one papyrus that attests 2 John 1, the Bodmer papyrus, but you have for the first verse about 3 letters that are extant. So it's hard to actually make a compelling reconstruction of what was there. So, it's interesting that you're like, wow, I wish we had this evidence, but it's just we have the 2 big ones, and then really you're jumping now into a much later period. And this is where now you have minuscules become important, right? These, Greek manuscripts that, because they're generally later, right? Kind of the 7th, 8th, 9th century and later, you get more of the manuscript, not just often dealing with a small fragment or something. And they go right through like the 15th century or so. And of course we have a lot of these. There's like, 2,000 plus of these manuscripts of different sections of the New Testament in total. It's our biggest evidence for the text of the New Testament. Now, when you look at 2 John, it's, that number's not nearly that big, but you have, a few hundred manuscripts. And as I began working through some of these, a lot of them preserve the standard reading, right? They call it the, quote, Byzantine text, which is just the shorter reading, right? Eclecte Curia. But there was actually a cluster of manuscripts that had this longer reading where it said Eclecte te Curia. And the earliest of these dated to the 11th century. It was actually an important manuscript. It was judged by, there were some New Testament textual scholars, the Alans, that had done a lot of work. And they said, well, here in the Catholic epistles, this manuscript, which is in St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, they say this is like category 1, meaning the text type preserved is as good as any ancient manuscript, even though it comes from the 11th century, which I thought was, wow, this is really important. We have this reading.
Just
and then
because
what I noticed
later doesn't always mean it comes from a later period. It has earlier traces.
It is really, and so it's always, there's a ton of work being done now on these manuscripts, minuscules saying, yeah, they might be later, but in fact, they might have some really important readings or preserve a text that's no longer extant. And so you kind of have to go in and kind of this art say, okay, what can we say about a manuscript or a profile of a manuscript? And the profile of this manuscript was in the Catholic epistle saying this is not the standard Byzantine. It's actually a text that goes back somewhat, it's preserving a much earlier tradition. And so I thought that was significant. So we do have it there. And then what's interesting is that in a group of related manuscripts, you have this same reading. And why this becomes important with minuscules is they talk about, right, genealogies of manuscripts, because it's not inconceivable. Somebody could say, you know what this is in this one manuscript is the opposite of haplography is ditography. You repeat something. And so you could say, well, what ascribed it here? They just repeated the te. It's just an example of ditography. And that certainly could be a possibility. But when you get the same variant repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated again by copyists, it's very clear this is not an inadvertent mistake. This is actually a deliberate variant reading. Mm-hmm. And so that then strengthens this is a legitimate variant. And so there are a group of manuscripts from the 11th century up through about the 14th, 15th century that do preserve this longer reading. Mm-hmm. And so it is there. Now, I wish we had earlier, readings for this, but it's there and you're saying, okay, and it makes sense in Greek. So I'm like, we have the reading. And it's interesting, when you look at the Greek New Testament, you have various readings. They will print today saying, this is the best reading, where our manuscript evidence is only from much, much later manuscripts. Probably the most famous case of this, I mentioned this in the book, is the case in Matthew, where you have, Jesus before Pilate, and he says, who will I release to you, Jesus or Barabbas? Well, in a number of early manuscripts, it was, do I release to you Jesus or Jesus Barabbas? And this reading, Origen knows about this. So Origen's a early Christian commentator in 3rd century, says, I'm aware in this reading, but I don't like it because he says, no sinful person could have the name, Jesus. That's kind of his argument. For what it's worth, that was his argument. And so we know it's there in the 3rd century. Now, what's interesting is this reading does not appear in any of the major manuscripts, not in Vaticanus, because it's none. But all of a sudden, you find it now in the 9th century in a group of manuscripts. And so the feeling of the committee, who has the standard Greek edition, is that, no, this is a reading that likely then Jesus got dropped. Let's actually include it in the text. I say what we're seeing here in 2 John 1, what I'm arguing is not unlike that. Although I say in this case, I think it's much stronger because the way the Greek reads presently doesn't actually make sense in light of epistolary papyri. It makes no sense. It doesn't work. And so I say it's like that. We have an early commentators like Clement saying, look, here's the reading, reading as a lady. And then you find this reading clear with its extra, tau eta, in minuscule manuscripts. And so the reading is attested late, but nonetheless is, I think, significant and enough case to say, yeah, this is a legitimate reading. And I think when you look at the Greek and other things, you're saying, yeah, this has got to be what the reading was originally in 2 John.
Yeah. Lincoln, your rereading of this, along with the evidence that you're pulling together, has got to have gotten a lot of reactions, both pro and con. What are some of the people saying who are really on your side? And what are some of the detractors? And is it largely theological in that they're agreeing or disagreeing? Or is it on this technical side on when the manuscripts are coming and how old they are and so forth?
Yeah, so far I've read a lot of really positive feedback, presented this paper, multiple venues. And, of course, people often want to say, well, you make a great point. I need to chew on it for a while before I can really, make a statement. But, it's interesting. Talking to papyrologists, they're like, of course, this is the reading. What else would it be? It doesn't make any sense. You talk to New Testament scholars, they're much more reticent to be like, okay, we want to really make sure because we start, and I can understand, messing around with the text or making even just a 2-letter change. But overall, it's been really overall. Of course, as you mentioned, the book's only been out a couple months, so I suspect by this summer I'll get some reviews, and I suspect if people aren't as positive, I'll start seeing that there. I think, Greek-wise, I think the biggest, strength of this reading, we have manuscripts, we have the name, Clement, but my biggest pushback is the Greek doesn't make sense in 2 John 1. Based on it doesn't make sense. And what's beautiful is you have 3 John 1 said that makes perfect sense. And you can explain this. I think that just if you look at that and say, okay, that makes sense. I would hope that people be welcome and say, you know what, this makes a lot more sense. And wow, we actually have a letter written to a named woman. That's a welcome addition. And, if somebody were to be theologically nervous about this, my initial response is, yes, it refines some things, but it doesn't drastically change theologically the purpose of the letter. I think you can read the letter in many of the same ways, refine a couple, we'll talk about actual house church. There's some things here. I don't think that it has huge theological implications by any means. It's just, okay, there's an actual named woman, and she's functioning like other named women in the New Testament who have some position, right? In fact, even churches might be meeting in their homes, like in the case of Nympha. And so I don't think there's anything iconoclastic with that argument. I do suspect that there will be some pushback. Some people, will push back on the reading. Traditionally, the biggest, no one's proposed, right, this missing te, right? They just took it as, well, let's just read Eclecte as a name, Curia as, lady. People have kind of addressed it saying, could you read it in this way? They've also historically flipped and said, could you read it as elect Curia, meaning Curia is a proper name. Doesn't work because, the way that your letters are written. But the big argument, people say, well, the name doesn't exist. Okay, well, that one, you can't argue with that anymore. The biggest one historically is, well, if you read the first, this Eclecta as a name, then you have to read the Eclecte at the bottom as a proper name also. And they said, well, then you have two sisters having the same name. Well, again, it goes back to the grammar. You can actually have a name in the first verse and adjective there. In fact, you can't read in verse 13, it's impossible to be a name. It has a definite article. It's an attributive. It's attributive to sister, so it's elect sister. And of course, in the first verse, as I put out in the book, is you have to explain why is there no definite article here before it. It was an adjective, you'd want a definite article. And you have letter, it's a proper name. So that's kind of the big one. And I do point out, yes, you do actually have people in the ancient world where siblings have the same name. They weren't two original. In Egypt, I can think of multiple letters where two brothers are both named Ptolemy. Or something like that, but it's just the grammar. No, it's just, you got to pay attention. It's just, it can be a proper name and it's an adjective at the end. And then I'd say it's like a pun on sister, right? I don't think it was inadvertent. He's calling her, right, your elect sister. You could even say she's like you. She's elect, and even you in some ways are, like your name connotes. So those are probably, I think, the big ones there. I think manuscripts, people, could say, yeah, the manuscript evidence isn't, we don't have it earlier on. Of course, I'd say if the manuscript evidence is, we only have, 2 John 1 attested really in 2 manuscripts up to, the first 7 or 8 centuries. Wow. The actual full verse, we actually say, okay, this is clearly the reading. And I get, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, right? Those are important texts. But, you can see how reading kind of creeps in and then kind of becomes standardized. I should point out one other item that I mentioned a bit in the book, but could certainly be fleshed out. When you get into the 3rd and 4th century, Greek epistolary, prescripts change. And so instead of always beginning with, you have the sender, name of the addressee, and then modifiers, it actually starts with who you were addressing will come first. And in those, actually, you can have an adjective can front a name in the 3rd and 4th century. So one of the things I'm wondering is if that, this short reading gets printed, right, in Vaticanus Sinaiticus, people could still be reading it. I guess you could read as, you could read as elect lady because maybe epistolary changes, but are people then still reading as just to Eclecte, the lady, because you can do some of this, but, is there in manuscripts? And so I think there's a precedent with Clement that in fact, it's there early on as the reading. Anyway, those are kind of some thoughts. Yeah.
Sorry to speak over you, Lincoln. I was going to say, for all the 3rd graders who are learning grammar, it matters.
It really, the grammar really, really matters. And it's just, these little things that, you wouldn't, I think this might be one of the most important articular, meaning variants of an article in the entire New Testament because of what it does. Yeah. You have these, in manuscripts, you have lots of different, variants, right? And these are minor, right? An article dropped, a different termination. And a lot of the time it's like, okay, this is what's going on. It's pretty clear. In this case, this is huge because now you introduce a named woman into the text.
Paying attention to these things really, really matters. You alluded to this a bit in terms of, does how we interpret the addressee of the letter change how we read the rest of the letter? And then for those who are teaching it in Christian communities, does that change how we approach the text at all?
What I would do is this way. I say I kind of read it in some of the ways like you do 3 John, like a personal letter addressed to somebody who is trusted, right, giving some instructions. As I look at this, right, we talked about, right, a lady. We talked about, looking at what I would say like a house church has some, right, authority over the domain. So, with this letter, it would be just kind of like similar to 3 John. If you look at it, where, it's a personal letter, much like in 3 John, where the elder says, I want to come and speak with you, right, to God, face to face. You have the same metaphor used there. Literally, the Greek is mouth to mouth, but just kind of idiom for, kind of a close relationship. And so I think about teaching, this, in sense of, what changes we made here. We're dealing with a more localized congregation. And I think the important role that Eclecte is playing there is that, people can play with, like, dealing here with an ecclesiastical superior saying, yeah, I'll follow your directives, these will be enforced. I'm a person you can trust. This is what the elder seems to be implying. I can trust you, you can go, and you will do this. And I have a lot more to say, and I'm going to come and now speak to you face to face. And again, when you think about it in this light, that really doesn't make great sense with a metaphorical church. Right? If you think this is some metaphor, why are you saying I'm going to come and speak to you, literally, face to face? No, there's an actual person, there's a group. I'm going to come, and I'm going to even tell you more. And so I think it adds those really kind of personal elements that you then find in 3 John. Because again, they're written by the same author. And so you find that in both letters.
Yeah. Lincoln, as your reading gains more acceptance, what do you expect people to do with this? How do you think it'll change Bible translations? And perhaps more, what would you warn people about overreading? Would that even be possible here?
Yeah, I'll start with that because I do, warn this. Somebody, a scholar who I won't mention, kind of joked around and said, well, if you had a chapter and made this really controversial about the early church suppressing an early leader, they said, you'll actually sell way more books. You'll get a lot more attention. Because there is, I think there's an appetite for this. That they're suppressing stuff. They're suppressing women, or something like this, or something's being hidden deliberately. I looked at the evidence, and I looked at the evidence just purely as a, papyrologist doing this. I could find no early evidence this name is being suppressed deliberately. And so, when you hear some of these arguments, sometimes, in their more extreme forms, I always would caution people against some of this. There may be some case of, some suppression things going on. But, speaking here to this specific case, I found no evidence of that. This is such a common, typographical error that it's just basically, it's common. It's no one, I don't see anybody trying to remove her. It's just these things happen and then a reading changes. That would be something I would warn, against, that point there, kind of that extreme. So I kind of repeat that throughout the book. Now you get into the 6th and 7th century and 8th century, I do find when you actually have some more commentary on 2 John 1, there does seem to be a push to want to read this not as a woman, but more like a congregation. In fact, some people bring this up saying, you could read it both ways, but you really should read it this way. And I do see an emphasis maybe beginning 6th, 7th, 8th century and beyond to say it works far better maybe as a more, letter to have it as just a general church. So I see an emphasis there, but I don't see this as starting early on and why this reading got dropped. Now I've gone to that. You mentioned it for a first question. I need to still answer. Can you repeat that?
Sure. You make me have to
I'm like,
remember.
I went on a tangent there, and now I'm trying to remember the first
I think it was
one.
related to translations, and
Yes.
Is this going to end up in? Hopefully, it ends up in the apparatus. The next Nestle Alan 29 that comes out, right?
Right.
Yeah, this is a good question. I would hope this would be the at some point would be the reading, because I just think on all grounds it makes total sense. The Greek. And there are precedents, right? With Jesus Barabbas, you have something similar going on there, and they include that in the reading. I have been in touch with people with the Nestle Aland. I've been in touch with people who are also reached out to them. A challenge that has arisen, and again, whether or not this reading makes it or not, is the United Bible Society. The 6th edition just came out just a few months ago, and the agreement is that when the Nestle Aland 29 comes out, they're supposed to have the same Greek text. That's kind of the standard agreement. And so I kind of thought, well, I really wish this book, I could have got this out about a year ago, because then maybe it could have, and so I know there is a challenge on that, and that the agreement between two, we will print the same Greek text. That's kind of been the standard since I think about the USB 3 or 4, or UBS 3 or 4. So I'm not sure. When you look at the Nestle Aland, no one ever makes a note on this. Like, it's one of the few verses, there's no note on 2 John 1. I would expect the bare minimum, even in the, hopefully in the 29, they'd make a note. Again, I'd love it for it to break protocol and be in there. I would hope that, with changes, and you see this, with things like, Junia or others, or there's been some debate, this is really a process of decades. Let it get out there, let it kind of sink in. And, probably more of a process than one kind of dramatic event. But yes, I am very much rooting for that. I would hope that would happen. I think it makes sense. I think it'd be nice to restore somebody who's been there, who's been lost. When I translate ancient documents, I mentions the preface in the book. One of the things I really love when I read ancient letters or any ancient text is here is somebody who lived, on the earth, 1,800 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 2,300 years ago, and all they have left are a few lines. And so I always find some personal satisfaction is kind of bringing them to light, however slight. It's like, hey, here's this person, they lived, here's one snapshot of their life. And so I think in that regard, it would be, for me, really, a wonderful thing if somebody who was there, in the New Testament, a woman that got, inadvertently removed, is brought back, is restored to the text.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
That'd be great.
So Lincoln, what's on the horizon? You're headed off to Egypt to dig through more manuscripts. I guess it may depend on what you uncover as to what your next book's going to be on.
Yeah, so I'm heading off here in just a few days. We're part of a dig. I'll be doing some work out there, and so I'm always looking, what's available, with inscriptions and things. Probably the main work I'm working on right now is maybe you're aware of Didymus the Blind. He is a Christian, a very famous Christian commentator in the late 4th century, who writes a number of biblical commentaries. In fact, posthumously, he gets excommunicated and condemned, so his writings, a lot of them don't survive. But there were a stack of papyri discovered during the start of World War II in Tura, south of Cairo. And among these were, the writings of Didymus, also some writings of Origen. And he has lectures on Psalms 20 to 44. And what's unique about these is it is our earliest extant classroom lectures of a Christian teacher. So he's actually there in a classroom lecturing, and people are asking questions and everything. Wow. And some of these papyri, through a long story, ended up at BYU. I translated them a few years ago and published them, covering Psalm 26 through 29. And I'm just finishing the first ever English translation of his entire lectures on Psalms. They've been translated, they were done, most editions had Greek and then German. There's Italian translation done, 15, 20 years ago. And so for SBL, there's Writings of the Greco-Roman World. I'm working hard to finish that. It's challenging because it's going to end up being about 900 to 1,000 pages. But these are really fascinating, our earliest extant Christian lecture series, and it's on the Psalms. And Didymus is really quite an interesting teacher. And so I'm working on that, spending a lot of time on that, trying to get that done. I would love to have that in by the end of the year, but we'll see how it goes.
Wow. The next Hermeneia series on that section of Psalms, I guess. Right?
Yeah, well,
huge.
He's really interesting. I don't know if his extent of allegory and metaphor, it brings in numerology, all kinds of things. You're like, wow, this is really kind of out there. He has some really remarkable, one thing I'd say about Didymus is some of the interpretation, I'm like, this is, I feel there's kind of a level of, being contrived and kind of out there. But the one thing that really impresses me is how much he cares about his students and wants to impute virtue to them and say, look, if you read the Psalms, you will become a better disciple. So aside from all this numerology and stuff, he will go into talk about being perfect and all this. That really comes out saying you can read them and it will make you a better, Christian man or woman. And so something I really appreciate with Didymus, that's a constant focus on virtue and the acquisition by reading the Psalms.
Wow. Fascinating.
Yeah, well, we hope that your work really excites people to learn Greek and to learn grammar, not just simple Greek, but really dig into it. And to be able to see people in this way, not only Eclecte, but as you say, Didymus, the passion that comes out when you really pour yourself into these texts and can kind of reconstruct their own lives a little bit.
Absolutely. Now, your book is on Amazon, and it's very accessible, as I described it. Lincoln writes it sort of in an autobiographical manner where he walks you through the research that he did, and he explains the history of research. He dives into the manuscript tradition. While there's a bunch of Greek in there, I think it's understandable enough for a lay audience actually to consume. So we encourage you to go get a copy of his book, and I think you'll thoroughly enjoy it. Lincoln, thanks for joining us. Unfortunately, we're out of time. This has been a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did as well, and hopefully we can have you back to talk about Didymus the Blind, or perhaps one of these other textual issues that you've written about in the New Testament in the future. Thanks for your time.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests. Visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.